Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2020 Aday Distinguished Lecture. As Purdue University's Executive Vice President for Research and Partnerships, I'm honored to welcome you to this event, where you will have the opportunity to learn about the exceptional work of one of your colleagues. The Aday Award is Purdue's most prestigious award in the humanities and social sciences. I am pleased to have in the studio with me this year's awardee, Professor Jayson Lusk, Distinguished Professor and Head of the Department of Agricultural Economics. I also have with me Joan Fulton, Professor and Associate Head of the Department of Agricultural Economics, who nominated Professor Lusk for this award, and will introduce him. She will also moderate the Q&A following the lecture. During this event, please reach out to ask questions through our form displayed below. We will address as many as possible during our Q&A session immediately following the lecture. In addition to live streaming the event, a recording will be posted on the EVPRP website. Before I turn things over to Professor Fulton, I would like to offer a brief background on the award. Purdue alumna Luann Aday established this award to honor a recent achievement of major scientific impact by a Purdue faculty member in the humanities or social sciences. Aday received an honorary doctorate from Purdue in 2004 and is currently the Lorne D. Bain Distinguished Professor Emerita at the University of Texas, Houston School of Public Health. Recognizing the consistently impactful innovations and discoveries produced by Purdue's faculty, Aday endowed this award in 2017. Aday Award winners are nominated by their peers, selected by a committee of distinguished faculty, and are approved by the Executive Vice President for Research and Partnerships and the President of Purdue University. I will now turn things over to Professor Fulton.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Jayson Lusk, who is Distinguished Professor and Department Head of Agricultural Economics, and this year's recipient of the Luann Aday Award. Kate Murphy from the New York Times sums it up perfectly. Jayson Lusk is a food and agricultural economist who studies what we eat and why we eat it. Dr. Jayson Lusk is one of the most productive and impactful researchers. He published 55 articles in 2017 to 2018 alone, and more than 220 articles since the year 2000. His research ranges from advances in research methods in behavioral economics to policy analysis related to food, nutrition, health, and consumer satisfaction. Furthermore, he is a phenomenal communicator to both academic audiences and general audiences. His receiving of the Borlaug Cast Communication Award is evidence of his outstanding communications ability. His lecture today is sure to inspire us to think about food and food policy in new ways. Please join me in welcoming Jayson Lusk.
Thanks, Teresa and Joan. It's exciting to be here and to give this talk. I would say one upside of getting to do this virtually is I assume you're all applauding and are going to be laughing at any of the jokes that I make here today. I did want to also thank Joan for preparing this nomination. She does such a great job working to honor and get recognition for not just me, but all of our colleagues in the Department of Agricultural Economics. So thank you, Joan, for that. I also thought I'd mention that I got a nice note from Luann Aday, which was really fun. It turns out we share the same undergraduate alma mater, and we got to share some stories about that. So that was a really neat experience. So today I'm going to talk to you about an aspect of my research program and talk about the parts of that program that focus on some food policy issues. And I'm not going to take a bunch of policies and necessarily call them good, bad, and ugly per se, but I'm going to talk about some dimensions of policy that sometimes work and maybe don't always work quite the way we want them to. And why is this important? And I think one reason is that food policy is much more in the news. If you pick up a major newspaper or some of the best-selling books over the last several years, you see a lot of critiques of our food system. And I'm showing you a variety of examples of the kinds of headlines that you see that refer to our food system as broken. And of course, lots of other images that you see. There's Jamie Oliver on a daytime talk show talking about the so-called pink slime, or Mark Bittman, who is a New York Times writer and cookbook author for a while. When he describes a food system in one of his well-watched TED Talks, used a picture of an atomic bomb exploding. And of course, you all lived through the last 6 months, and there were a lot of disruptions in our food supply chain in March and April and May. And so I think the word that a lot of people describe when talking about that food system is that it's a system that's broken. Now, I'm not an adherent to that particular point of view. I think there's a lot that is great about our food system. In many ways, our food system is as good as it's ever been. But there are, of course, some serious problems, and I think folks have turned to the policy front in an attempt to try to make headway on solving some of these problems. And I'm not going to litigate them all, but I think here are some of the major issues that people talk about when they mention concerns with the food system. We have high rates of obesity and rising rates of some dietary-related diseases like type 2 diabetes. People are worried about environmental and climate impacts of both food production, which is a consequence of the choices that we make in the grocery store and restaurants. We've had a lot of progress and productivity growth in animal agriculture, but that's come alongside also concerns that some people have about the well-being of our farm animals. At the same time, we worry about maybe some groups of people having too many calories to eat. There's also concerns about some people not having enough and concerns about food security. That's particularly true when we talk about global problems and some of the micronutrient deficiencies we have in other parts of the world. There are also problems of foodborne illness that have been with us forever, but also are things that people worry about. And then lastly, just concerns about the structure and nature of our industry. Over time, we have fewer farmers. The farmers we do have gotten bigger. There's been a lot of consolidation in the agribusiness sector and in the retailing sector, and I think for many folks that is a worrying trend. And as a result, people propose policies, and I think we've increasingly been seeing a push towards not farm policies per se, which has been something historically that agricultural economists would work on, but more on the food side of the equation. And there are many examples. I've just got a few headlines for you to see here, everything from soda taxes to mandatory requirements that we label GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Vermont even has a policy where they ban food waste in their trash, and a variety of policies related to animal welfare issues. And again, this is just a very small set of examples that we can talk about. So maybe before giving you some specific examples from my own research, I think it might be worthwhile just to stop for a minute and ask, when we're talking about a policy, in this case food policy, how do we know if it's any good or not? Is it a good policy? Is it a bad policy? So here's some guidelines, some rough criteria that I tend to think about when thinking about whether a particular policy is something that is good or bad. One is, and I am an economist, so I'm going to use some particular economic lingo here, but does the policy actually solve a market failure? There are a lot of things that we don't like necessarily about the world, but not everything that's bad can be solved efficiently with a policy. So the normal kinds of market failures that we think about and talk about would be things like externalities. Do I impose costs on others that I'm not bearing myself? Issues about information asymmetry. Does that seller of that used car know more about the quality than I know? Or even issues of market power and concentration. Is there a monopoly or monopsony? Those are sort of the typical sorts of market failures that we worry about. So is there a market failure that we can demonstrate that the policy is actually addressing? Beyond that, there are issues like efficiency. And one rough way to think about this is just costs and benefits. Does a policy produce more in benefits than it creates in costs? But it's more than just that. Is this policy better? Does it create more benefits relative to costs than any other policies or other actions, such as maybe not acting or relying on various other institutions or private industry to solve? Another issue is equity, and I'm going to give you some examples of this in a minute. I think in this country we have a progressive tax rate, so people that make more income pay a higher percentage of their income in tax. And I think there's a support for this kind of proportionality. In the food space, one concern is that people that make more money tend to spend a smaller share of their income on food. And so as a result, when we think about food policies that affect the price of food, those burdens tend to be borne disproportionately by lower income consumers. So I think that's a particular concern with a lot of food policies that we have to think about. Of course, one question is, does the policy actually do what it intends to do? And it might be surprising, but in fact, there are many examples where it doesn't. and I think it's something we have to think about. The other thing is, does it do things that we didn't mean for it to do? Does it create other kinds of unintended consequences? And lastly, I'll just mention, and this is maybe my own particular point of view, but policies that give people the benefit of the doubt, preserve their freedom. Maybe another way to say this is not overly coercive. For example, we could probably solve some of the obesity problems if we put a ban on all kinds of food and prescribed a very strict diet to every American, but that might be a kind of world a lot of people wouldn't want to live in. Now, I should note that many of these guideposts here that we might want to use to evaluate a policy are often in tension with each other. And as a result, you're not going to be able to check all the boxes here, but I think they provide a useful framework in thinking about the merits of a particular policy. So what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is just give you a little bit of a tour of some of the policies that my colleagues and I have studied and give you a few insights. And I'm not going to tell you this particular policy is good or bad, but what I'm going to try to do is bring out parts of the policy that we've studied that point to some of those guidepost issues that we talked about before. So let me talk about food prices. So if people are eating too unhealthily and not eating enough of the good stuff, I think a lot of people, often a lot of non-economists say, well, that's simple, just change the prices. Make the fruits and vegetables more affordable, make the sodas and the donuts more expensive, and that will help solve the problem. Those kinds of policies tend to have very complicated effects. I'm just going to talk about a particular set of those. So this is a research project that I did a few years ago with some of my French colleagues, Laurent Muller, Anne Lacroix, and Bernard Raffieux. And one of the things we did in this study, I think a theme sort of in my research, is trying to answer these sorts of questions in a way that makes people put their money where their mouth is. We all know people can answer surveys in ways that don't reflect the way they actually shop or vote. And as a result, we try to think carefully about either on surveys asking questions in a way that we can get a good prediction of behavior, or putting people in environments where there are consequences for the choice they made. So in this particular study, we recruited groups of French consumers, and we made a lot of effort to recruit particularly low-income French consumers in addition to regular income consumers. And one of the things we did in this lab setting is we asked people first to just tell us everything they ate the previous day. And we had a computer program, went meal by meal, quantity by quantity, and just declare what they had to eat. And then the experiment came. Then we said, okay, now what we want you to do is to tell us what you would buy at these sets of prices for an entire meal tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, we're going to randomly select some of the choices you made, and you'll really have to buy them. So that's where the money where your mouth is part comes into play. Then once we had that baseline kind of set of choices, we looked at these policy issues. We asked people to repeat a day where we reduced the price of fruits and vegetables by 30%. And then we had them do yet another day where we both reduced the prices of fruits and vegetables, but then also increased the price of some unhealthy items. And what we're interested in is, how did people's behavior change when going from sort of a regular day to the policy enacted days? In particular, what I'm going to talk about here is a comparison of the lower income households to the higher income households. So what you can see on the left-hand side here is, what's the average subsidy that people received from this exercise, going from that first day to the day where there's both the subsidies and the taxes. So you can see the lower income households received about 77 euro cents in subsidies from their purchases. But the high income people received almost double that, about $1 or €1.40 almost. Now, why would that happen? Well, the answer is higher income households were already eating more healthy. So the subsidies flowed in a way that already went to people that didn't need their behavior changed. On the tax side of things, you can see the reverse of that. Low income people actually paid more in tax, again, 2 to 3 times more in tax than the higher income households did. And again, that's a result of the fact the lower income households were already had more unhealthy diets. But one unexpected behavior was that the lower income households didn't respond as much. They were more habit prone and stuck to their original diets. And as a result, if we look kind of at an overall price index, the higher income households were able to reduce the cost of their diet by about 22%, whereas the lower income households only on average about 8.6%. Interestingly, if you look at the distribution of those outcomes, these red lines are the low income households, the black ones are the high income. The little dash, the difference between the dashed and solid lines are simply if we evaluate purchases relative to their initial consumption bundle or their new consumption bundle, and the further away those lines are, that tells us how much people responded to the price policies. So the fact that those two red lines are kind of close to each other means the lower income households just didn't respond as much. And you can also see that about 30% of those low income households actually had diets that were much more expensive, or at least somewhat more expensive than was the case before the policy. Whereas for the high income households, once they responded, adjusted to the policies, all of them had cheaper diets. So did this policy achieve the intended outcome? I don't know. I don't have the results here in terms of what changed in terms of the dietary composition, the composition of their diets in terms of nutrients. But what we do know is it creates potentially some very unequal outcomes, exasperates maybe some inequality problems that we wouldn't have otherwise. Again, not necessarily an overall condemnation of the policy, but it's maybe an outcome that wasn't anticipated that maybe needs to be taken into consideration. Another policy that's gained a lot of attention over the last several years is GMO labeling. Should we require companies to disclose whether they use ingredients that have been produced through genetic engineering? I actually worked on some of these topics in the late 1990s, and there was so much work at that time. I thought, good grief, there's no more that can be learned on this topic, and the topic kind of went away. Then all of a sudden, California had a ballot initiative in 2012 that would require mandatory labeling, and it became the hot topic again. And come to find out, there were lots of things we didn't know that we needed to study. Ultimately, what happened is we passed a federal mandatory labeling policy that does require disclosure. Now that disclosure can come in the form of a QR code on a food product or a new label that you can see here that's derived from bioengineering, one that's entirely new, had not been studied at the time. And of course, there is voluntary labeling, such as this butterfly, the non-GMO project, that companies can disclose that they don't have genetically engineered ingredients. So what would happen if these labels hadn't been studied before? How might companies respond, or how might we predict consumers will respond to these new labels? So this is one study that we did that was a survey-based study. One of the things we noticed is, and this is not surprising at all, but if you just look at, say, the relative premium people were willing to pay for that non-GMO labeling versus, say, that QR code disclosure, it's a very small premium. But if you have to use the text, the words, like this product may contain genetic engineering, not surprisingly, people seek more to avoid that GMO labeling when disclosing by words. So it's one reason a lot of the proponents of this law were very upset when you could disclose by a QR code. In fact, nobody was really very happy with this law, which maybe tells you it was a compromise sort of policy. One unintended consequence potentially of this policy, and you can see this maybe a little bit in these results, is that if you stack the two labels, organic and non-GMO, it doesn't really add very much. And in fact, in one case, people responded more to that non-GMO label than they did the organic label. And that's interesting because organic certifies a number of processes, including non-GMO. So what this means, or the results are sort of telling us, is that consumers in their mind interpreted these two labels somewhat as substitutes for each other, even though organic is a much broader set of claims and products. As a result, once this law passed, we saw indeed a lot of organic companies and organic trade associations coming out with claims and advertisements that organic is non-GMO and more. And so I think, again, this is an example where I think outcomes and implications of those policies were not what we thought they might be early on. Let me give you an example related to GMO labeling where I actually changed my mind due to the research we conducted. So one of the concerns that was often expressed about use of genetic engineering, which I should note, by the way, all of our major scientific authorities have concluded that crops produced through genetic engineering are no more or less risky in terms of human health than traditionally bred crops. So one of the concerns is if we mandate this label and people see this label on their product, it may serve as sort of a skull and crossbones. It made people think it was more dangerous than it would have been otherwise. Otherwise, why would the government be requiring that we have a label on this product? And that was a view that I held and used in various arguments. So we thought we should actually test it. So here's a study that I did with a colleague, Marco Costbenefit, and we did a study where we just exposed different groups of people to different labels. These were apples, and they varied in terms of price, and they varied in terms of things like the color, were they red or were they green? Did they have bruising or not? And then did it have a label or not? One group of people saw those apples with said this product was ripened using ethylene. I've never seen that label. We just made it up as a kind of a controlled condition. Another group of people saw that same set of choices, but instead there was that kind of GMO butterfly label. This product does not contain GMOs. And then the last group saw a disclosure on some of those apples that said this apple was produced through genetic engineering. Now, we're not really concerned in terms of this paper with which apples people chose, but what we were interested in is after being exposed to those labels, what did people think about this question? Is genetically engineered food safe to eat? Because presumably, if the label made people more concerned, you might say, why was that label on there? Maybe this is something I should be thinking more about. We would expect people to think that GMOs are less safe, but we don't actually find that at all. In fact, there's no statistical difference in terms of people's beliefs about safety in these different labeling conditions. In fact, if anything, people are actually a little more likely to say they were safe to eat when exposed to these mandatory labels. So that was sort of a first, shot across the bow, so to speak. And then a couple of years later, this is a recent study that I did with Jane Kolodinsky, and it turns out she had been surveying consumers in Vermont repeatedly. And Vermont is the only state in the nation that did pass a GMO labeling law that went into place before the federal law superseded it. And so she had surveys before and after that law went in place. Now it turns out I had also been running a tracking survey nationwide. And after seeing Jane give a presentation, I asked, do you want to team up? Let's pull our data together and see if we can see what impact this law in Vermont had on people's beliefs about the safety of genetically engineered crops. And so that's what we can see here. So before that labeling went into place in Vermont consumers were more concerned about genetically engineered crops than were consumers in the rest of the United States. That's maybe not all that surprising. They did, after all, pass a law. But the more interesting question is what happens after the law went into effect. And our estimates, our projections suggest that actually the consumers in Vermont became less concerned about the safety of genetically engineered crops after that label went into effect, which is just the opposite of sort of what my beliefs had been beforehand. Now, again, doesn't mean GMO labeling is a good thing. It just means it doesn't have this unintended consequence that I thought that it might have after the fact. So if we're going to good, bad, and ugly, I put this in the category of not as bad as I thought. On this, one more slide, talk about some research on GMO labeling, and I just throw this out there to say how important it is to be cautious about some survey results. So one of the things that motivated a lot of this policy discussion were survey polls like this. This is actually a study that I did with Brandon McFadden, where we asked people, do you support or oppose a mandatory labeling policy for foods that have genetically engineered ingredients? About 84%, I believe, in this survey said, yes, I support that. And that's very consistent with a lot of other polls. And this kind of result was one of those results that was used commonly in sort of the public debate in favor of this policy. But on this survey, we also asked people a very similar kind of question. We asked, do you support or oppose labeling food that contains DNA? Also, 80% of people support that policy. Now that's an absurd policy. All food, anything that's living, has DNA in it. And so I think it shows you a little bit that, maybe people aren't, answering the question we think they're answering. Perhaps what they're answering is an easier question in their mind to answer, which is, here's something unusual or that you haven't thought much about before. Do you want free information? I should say, by the way, this survey result, I've repeated this question numerous times over the years, different wording, different framings. We always get about the same result. And I would say it's probably one of the research results that I thought I sort of just on a whim put it on a survey several years ago. It's probably the one thing that's captured more attention than any of the more quote unquote serious research that we've done over the years. One last point on this, and that is that one of the things we maybe learned is we've been asking the wrong question. People are wanting to know, do consumers want mandatory labeling of GMOs? But I started asking a question like this on some surveys we put out, and that is, who do you think should be making this decision? Is it you, the consumer, or is it the experts? We ask this in different ways. Should it be the FDA, USDA? And what we find is actually the majority of people say this is a decision that should be decided by the experts, not by the average citizen. I find that pretty remarkable. I'm a pretty freedom-loving guy, but so you might say, how is this consistent with that view? But we all defer to experts in our daily life. We go to the CPA for advice on our taxes, or to a retirement counselor if we want some advice on that front. So we know in various areas of our life where we don't have enough information and we want others to try to help us make an informed choice. And that's sort of my interpretation of this result, is that people sort of understand this is a complex, nuanced issue that probably should be decided in a very different way. Let's talk about maybe one of the biggest food policies that exists, and that's SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, most colloquially known as food stamps. So people think about the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and think farm programs, farm subsidies. Actually, 80% of the USDA budget goes towards SNAP programs. So it's one of the biggest food and farm programs that we have out there. How does SNAP work? It basically is a transfer of money to consumers to spend on food. So there's been a variety of initiatives over the years to change SNAP and maybe use it as a tool to improve the healthfulness of diets. So economists has some theories about this, and one of them is, actually this goes back to the 1940s when we were considering some of these policies, and that is that giving SNAP dollars, coupons to people that say you can only use these coupons on food, actually is exactly the same as just giving people cash, as long as people are spending more on food than they receive in SNAP benefits. So the technical lingo there is if they're inframarginal consumers, we would expect giving SNAP dollars to be exactly the same as giving cash. So a variation on that same hypothesis that I've tried to emphasize over the years is when people say, well, you can take your SNAP dollars, but we're not going to allow you to use those SNAP dollars to buy things like sugared soda. Well, actually, that same kind of thinking holds here. That policy is not going to affect people's soda purchases as long as they're not spending more on soda than they receive in those SNAP benefits. Now, nobody spends more on soda than they receive in SNAP benefits. I should back up and also say almost everybody, the vast majority of people who receive SNAP spend more on groceries than they receive in SNAP. Now, why would this policy not work? So I've got a picture of a grocery store checkout aisle, and sometimes you see those little dividers, and normally those dividers, separate your groceries from the person in front of you. But one way to think about that is imagine I'm going shopping, I have SNAP benefits, but I know I'm going to spend more on food than I have in SNAP, so I'm going to put the set of foods that I'm going to pay in cash on one side of this divider, and I'm going to put the set of foods I'm going to pay for with SNAP on the other side of this divider, and I go and check out, and then but now the policy comes along and says, oh, by the way, you can't buy those sodas with SNAP benefits. What am I going to do? I'm just going to pick up the soda, move it on one side of the divider, pick something else, maybe the potatoes on the other side of that divider, and put it on the other, and I can still have the sodas, and my total overall food spending isn't changed. Now, in reality, SNAP works in a sort of a debit card way, and it works behind the scenes. You just check out, and it does all the calculations for you, but the effect is still the same. And likewise, if you subsidize fruits and vegetables, the theory there tells us that it really will act something more like an income transfer, as long as people are already spending more money, again, on SNAP than they spend on fruits and vegetables. So, despite this theory, testing those theories has been really tough. And there's been a big change in economics, I'd say, over the last 15 or 20 years, often referred to as the credibility revolution, to try to get at more causal estimates, not just correlations, associations. Another way to try to answer these things are through experiments, and that's something that I did in this paper with Amanda Weaver, where we tried to test these experiments in sort of an abstract environment. What we did is we recruited groups of people to have lunch with us, and we gave people money for having this lunch with us, and they chose from different menus. We put people in different treatments. The one I've got on the screen here for you, we gave them $10 to show up, and then we gave them something like a SNAP benefit. We said, here's a $2 coupon that you can use, but it can only be used on this menu, and this one has the policy that's the soda ban. You can use anything on this menu except soda, okay? Now, our theory would say if somebody was already buying soda to begin with and spending more than $2, that ban shouldn't have any effect at all. But we went out to test all that. So on the little table I have here in front of you, the first column there shows the total spending people had in our lunch meals that we had with them. So if we gave people $10 cash versus $12 cash, people spend a little bit more money. This just means food is a normal good. You get more money, you spend a little more on food. Now, what about that SNAP benefit? What if instead of the extra $2, I gave you that $2 in something that looks like SNAP? It's a coupon that can only be spent on food. And the answer you can see there is it's a little lower spending than just giving $12 in cash. So you might say, well, Jason, doesn't that mean that theory isn't right, that giving cash is the same as giving a food coupon? But if we pull that $4.77 out and look at the groups of people who are already spending more than $2 on food, they're no different than if we just gave them cash. So you got to separate out the inframarginal from the extra marginal consumers. And when we do that, indeed, giving cash is the same as giving a SNAP benefit. What about those soda restrictions? Here you can see on that middle column, amount people spend on soda, actually restricting that food coupon to say you can't use soda with it actually did cause a pretty significant reduction in the average soda purchases. But again, we can pull out those people. You can tell from the data there, only about a third of the people actually chose soda to begin with in one of the original conditions. But if we look at those people who would have bought soda anyway and were spending more than $2, it only caused a small reduction in soda purchases. But we were able to reject the theory, actually, that soda ban caused a reduction in soda even among that group of people. Why would that happen? It's speculation, but one possible answer is, when you put that kind of ban on there, maybe it's sending a signal to people. Now, I mentioned the GMO case; that didn't send a signal, but here maybe that ban says this is something maybe you shouldn't be buying. So I'll end with a couple of examples related to eggs, and before wrapping up with some broader thoughts. I mentioned some of the animal welfare laws. One of the biggest, most impactful ones in recent years started back in 2008. So we're about to have a presidential election here in a few weeks. So back in 2008, when John McCain and Barack Obama were running for office, on that same ballot out in California, voters there were voting on a ballot initiative that was related to animal welfare. Many people interpreted it as saying they were going to ban cage-free or caged chickens. That's not actually what happened, but that's ultimately sort of what effect it was. It was passed by almost 65% of voters voted in favor of that animal welfare law. So what are the consequences of that law? Well, a couple of things. The graph I'm showing you here is the number of egg-laying hens in California. There was a big drop-off in the early 2000s because of an animal disease issue, but then you can see the number of egg-laying hens in California is about 20 million. At any one point in time. It was fairly steady despite some ups and downs. And nothing really happened right after that law passed. But there was one unintended consequence which they figured out pretty soon, and that was the law that was passed by the voters said producers can't have chickens in cages that are of a certain size. But they soon figured out that, well, what's going to happen then is grocery stores are just going to import cheaper eggs from other states. So the producers in that state got together, and there was a state law that passed as well. Ultimately, all this was enforced through a set of food safety regulations in California that imposed a minimum space constraint. So what you can see at the tail end of this graph is that there's been a dramatic reduction in the number of egg-laying hens in California, almost halving over this time period. So certainly the cost to California egg producers has been pretty significant because there's not nearly as much production in that state. I should note, by the way, that Indiana also gained a lot of production over time. Indiana is now the number 2 egg producing state in the country. So what was the impact on prices to consumers? So we got retail scanner data from grocery stores, and looked at egg prices before and after these laws went into place. So we have California, and then we have some control locations. What we can see in the data is that eggs in California are just more expensive. They were about 62 cents per dozen on average, even before this law went into place. Why did that happen? I don't know. Lots of things are more expensive in California. That's not really our question. Our question is, how did that difference change after the law went into place? And what we noticed is, because could have been something crazy, just caused egg prices to increase everywhere. So what we need is the other locations as a kind of control group. And what we found is that early on, after that law first went into place, that egg prices in California jumped by about 33%. It was shortly after there that the bird flu occurred, so you might have seen some of that in the news. It caused egg prices to increase everywhere. But even still, like a year and a half afterwards, we're still projecting about a 9 or 10% higher egg prices in California than we would have observed otherwise. Now, is that too high or too low? I think that's a value judgment that we can't answer, but I think we can at least credibly calculate the cost of this policy. And so if you multiply that 10% by the millions of consumers in California, you get many millions of dollars of cost every year. One last egg example before starting to wrap up a little bit. We all just lived through COVID. I mentioned some of the disruptions that happened there. And one of the, of course, we all know toilet paper had a big impact in terms of availability. Probably beyond that, there were some other really big stories about the increase in egg prices at grocery stores. And the data I'm showing you here on the top line top left shows the trends in egg prices in February and March over this time period. The solid line is what actually happened. The dashed line is our prediction of what would have happened had COVID not occurred. You can see the big spike in retail egg prices. They went from about $1 a dozen to about $3 a dozen, 3 times increase in just a few weeks time period. So I think a naive, sort of observer might say, this is price gouging. Why didn't we just move all the eggs that would have gone to restaurants into the grocery store And one answer is the way we deliver eggs to grocery stores is different than the way we deliver eggs to restaurants. A lot of the eggs that get sent to restaurants are in this liquid form, and they tend to be concentrated, or not concentrated, but specialized facilities. So if you have a facility of egg-laying hens, that whole facility may be dedicated to producing these liquid eggs, we call them breaker eggs, that are pasteurized and then packaged in different ways and sent off. So even if you could turn around and resell those eggs, you would need cartons to do it. There just simply were not enough cartons to package these eggs in to get to the grocery store. It's not like you're going to have millions of cartons of eggs sitting around just on a whim. The other answer is that these firms are regulated differently. Because their eggs are pasteurized, they don't have to meet certain FDA rules, and so they couldn't send their eggs to the grocery store when we saw that big demand spike. The result is, down on the bottom left-hand side, that's the breaker egg prices. And again, the dashed line is what we predict would have happened otherwise. So initially there was kind of a run-up in those breaker egg prices, but then they fell pretty dramatically. The breaker egg prices were much lower than we predicted they would have been otherwise. Why? Restaurants weren't buying them. Restaurants were closed. We didn't need as many eggs early in that time period. Fortunately, within a few weeks, the FDA changed some of its laws and allowed those breaker eggs to be sold as shell eggs into the grocery market. The last graph there kind of tells us the impact of that law, that regulation that prevented eggs from flowing from areas of low demand to areas of high demand. And we predict that the breaking egg prices, this was a study with Trey Malone and Alex Schaefer, we predict the breaker egg prices would have been higher if that law wasn't existed, and that big run up in prices that we saw at the grocery store would have been much lower had we not had this law in place. So I think those are some really important regulations that prevented the free flow of food that presumably in normal times perhaps improve food safety, but in unusual times have consequences that can prevent the free flow of food. Now I've just given you a little smattering of papers that we've done over the years, but this is another set of maybe papers I've worked on over the last 5 or 10 years. All kinds of things, just to maybe, I'm not going to talk to you about all of them, but certainly examples of kinds of policies that have been proposed and where we get demand. People want to know what are the effect of these policies. So I'm going to wrap up with a few slides that just talk a little bit, maybe a little more philosophically. First, why do some policies fail? And I've kind of hinted at these as we go along. One is that people have different preferences from us often, particularly those of us that are academics, policymakers. We tend to have a relatively higher income, and we sometimes forget what it's like if your income is a little bit lower. That's that Engel curve I referred to earlier. So I think we have to be careful about not imposing our preferences and beliefs on others. And like I mentioned in the sort of fat tax thin subsidy paper, there's a lot of heterogeneity out there, both income heterogeneity, but also within low-income households. Some respond a lot and some don't respond very much at all. And so even though we look at averages, there are very disparate impacts that happen across different kinds of people. Sometimes I think as analysts, we don't know enough about the context. And I see that a lot in the food and agricultural policy debates. I'm fortunate to work in an agricultural college, lots of connections to production agriculture and the agricultural supply chain. And often these food policies are enacted without really understanding how that supply chain works, how animals are grown in different systems, in different parts of the country with different feeding. And so I think those nuances are often really important in trying to understand those issues. I talked a little bit already about research methods. Sometimes they're things we want to know. They're just hard to know and hard to learn. I think that's a big problem in nutrition and epidemiology. It's not that they're doing anything wrong. It's just really hard to use observational data on what people are eating to infer causal estimates. And so as a result, I think there's some really difficult challenges that we need to think through. Also, I think there's a tendency sometimes to mistake scientific outcomes with values. What is versus what should we do? Science can tell us, what's the carbon impacts of beef production in this particular environment. It can't tell us what we should do. That's a value judgment. And as scientists, I think we need to understand that distinction there, that sometimes we can help provide those answers of should. I think this policy can do this or can do that. But the should part is something that's a little beyond our expertise. I'll also mention that lots of policies have trade-offs. And we all want to live in a world where we're healthy, no heart disease, no diabetes, no obesity. But we also want our food prices to be low. We want people in other countries to be well fed too. We want farmers to make high incomes. it's just hard to have all those things happen at the exact same time. And sometimes in life, we're looking for those unicorns. We want our cake and we want to have our cake and eat it too. And sometimes it's just really hard. And I think we have to understand those difficult trade-offs that often we got to give up one thing if we want to get something else. And that sometimes where those value judgments comes in. Is it worth it to have those trade-offs? So the last few comments here are about sort of models of public engagement and dealing with policy issues. How should we go about this and how is it normally done? Well, when I look at the policy landscape, I think a very common approach is what I might call an interest group approach. I want to maximize X, where X is a thing that interests me. It could be anything from public health to beef demand or farm income. In my particular case, it might be funding for agricultural research. Now, I think we kind of all understand the downsides of that kind of approach to policy advocacy, but I think it's probably one of the most common approaches. We economists often use more of that kind of cost-benefit analysis that I mentioned earlier. We want to maximize the size of the pie. I think a challenge with that approach is that it often doesn't do a good job taking those equity issues into consideration. And it also makes some assumptions that we often aren't very good at. And there's some philosophical beliefs behind it that in that cost-benefit analysis that it's everybody counts the same and it's the greatest good for the greatest number, but there aren't those kind of protections for minorities that we might wonder a little bit about. I think I'll end up with a couple of comments here, and that is a particular policy approach that's been one that's been associated with my department here at Purdue for probably half a century, and something called the alternatives and consequences approach. And that is, our job as analysts is to provide our best estimates of the outcomes of different policies. And then it's up to the policymakers and the public debate to decide what the outcomes are, because those are questions of value. So I think it's not an easy approach. We don't always, it doesn't answer this kind of meta question of why we should do the alternatives and consequences. Sometimes, we might ask, are we really considering all the alternatives, or are we letting our biases come in and selectively, report on some of those alternatives or consequences? But nonetheless, I think it's a fair approach for folks like myself working at a public institution where we're trying to help make decisions be as informed as we can. Last slide here, and that is, I think, the other aspect that I think we can do in addition to providing alternatives and consequences is to think about ways we can expand the opportunity set, both for consumers but also for the policymakers. And that is, can we provide new ideas, new alternatives, new ways of thinking about solving these policy problems that they haven't before? Maybe one example of this, I gave a TEDx talk here at Purdue last year, 2 years ago sometime. And one of the things I proposed in that talk was, instead of banning certain practices in animal welfare production, what if we thought about creating a market, maybe even like a cap and trade system to incentivize the promotion of animal welfare in a way that people haven't thought of. Now, if that sounds confusing to you, go watch the TED Talk. But the point is trying to come up with new ways of thinking about these sorts of problems and put new items on the table for people. So at this point, I'll stop, and I believe we're going to do some Q&A, and Joan, I believe, is going to moderate that from off screen. So happy to take any questions.
Well, that's great. We've got some questions that have been coming in, so keep them coming. So we'll start off the first one. Have there been any effects to livestock production and sales in the past 6 months? So I think particularly thinking about the impact of COVID here.
Absolutely. It's been one of the most disruptive and unusual times in livestock markets over the past 6 months that we've really seen in history. So first, there was the issue I already referred to in talking about eggs. We had these two big demand shifts, a big increase in demand at grocery stores, a huge reduction, destruction of demand from restaurants. And that caused a lot of turmoil in trying to move product from one market to another. And again, we package products for grocery stores differently than we package products for restaurants. So that was an initial disruption. We saw prices get pulled up somewhat and then kind of drop back down. But then the biggest disruption was the shutdown and close down that we had in many of our meat packing plants in this country. At one point, late April, early May, beef and pork processing was running about 40% below processing levels of the previous year, and there were a lot of concerns at that time about meat shortages. We saw some of the highest wholesale prices that we have seen in history in beef and pork. And at the same time, that was having a detrimental impact on livestock prices because packing plants didn't need as many animals because they weren't open, and that caused a lot of pressure on livestock producers, particularly hog producers, who have just-in-time delivery systems, and so we had a lot of pigs that got left on farms that had nowhere to go, and that puts an enormous strain on the system. So I could talk about this issue for a long time, but I think the short answer to that question is very disruptive, The good news is I think we're getting back to something that looks a little more normal. Processing is about where we saw at this time last year, and we're seeing retail prices starting to come back down to something that's more similar to our historical averages.
Great. Well, the questions are coming in here. The next one, the variety of food, vegetables, fruits, and grains in the U.S. is relatively smaller compared to other countries in Europe and Asia. This could be part of the underlying reason for nutrition deficiency. Are efforts improving through policymaking?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'd be a little careful about generalizing that much. We actually eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. One of our challenges here in this country is we just eat a lot more of everything. We tend to be one of the, a general trend in terms of we talk about meat production is as countries gain more income, they tend to add a little more animal protein to their diets. And as a consequence here in this country, we're sort of the king of meat eaters. But we also eat a lot of fruits and vegetables on a per capita basis compared to others. There's a really nice study that was done a few years ago that tried to really answer this question. Are we eating relatively more meat and relatively fewer fruits and vegetables because our incomes are different, because our prices are different, or because our preferences are different? We just like meat more than fruits and vegetables. And the answer was largely a combination of all those things, but in large part prices were a big role, and a lot of those are somewhat policy related that do affect those relative prices. But I think it does speak to the fact that obviously prices affect what consumers buy, and it could be one of the answers among many for why consumption patterns in this country differ from others.
Well, this next question really follows up on that, and this question relates to the issue of food waste. So are there policy examples you'd like to highlight in terms of food waste?
Yeah. I will say I'm a little bit of a heretic on the food waste question. Of course, nobody wants waste. We don't want to throw things out. And the reason we don't want to throw those out is all the resources that went into producing that food were valuable. We don't want to get rid of them. The question is, are the policy actions we take going to create more waste, more in cost than benefits? And I think that's a much more difficult question. In the developing world, a lot of the waste occurs because we don't have good infrastructure in our supply chain. So actually one of the innovations out of the College of Agriculture here in Purdue is in Africa. We have these PICS bags, Purdue Improved Crop Storage bags. These are bags that protect the crop from insect infestations. That is a food waste saving device. So I think some people forget the role that technology can play in solving some of these food waste issues. But you also got to remember when thinking about food waste, your time is valuable. Other people's time is valuable. And as a result of that, we got to, let's also think about this COVID issue for a minute. One of the challenges there was we've been asking grocery stores to cut back on food waste, which means not having extra inventory on hand. So we're telling grocery stores on the one hand, we don't want you having extra inventory because we don't want you throwing things out. Then all of a sudden we're in the middle of a pandemic and saying, why don't you have a bunch of extra food sitting around when we need it? So these things are in tension with each other, and there's some trade-offs that we got to think through and act on there. So my sort of preferred policy approach on that particular question is let's think about technological solutions that can reduce the cost of storage and inventory, so we can bring that food waste through that particular mechanism.
Okay, shifting gears just a little bit. Early on in your talk, you talked about the research you did with your colleagues in France. And so the question came in, a one-day study does not account for long-term behavior change. Dietary change can take months. What if the policy was implemented over the course of a year? Would you find something different?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. It is a challenge with experiments of this nature. But actually, I think in terms of the price impacts of our policy, what we're observing is probably an upper bound to the change you might expect to occur. Why? Because the price changes are obvious and immediate. You're not having to shop around, and you're not, you're paying attention to the changes that we made in the context of our experiment. So actually my hypothesis would be, and it's a testable one that we could test out, would be that actually over time, if you implemented the same policy in the field, the effects would be somewhat smaller than what we observe, not larger, because we're focusing people's attention on this issue in this lab. But I think it is a really good question. Questions about adaptation and how people respond over time, I think is a really important one. It's really hard to do in the kinds of experiments we've done, but I think it's a great question.
Well, building on the idea of adaptation, we're going to jump back to some COVID questions. So a second wave is expected in the near future in terms of COVID. What do you expect is going to happen to food supply?
Boy, let's hold on to our boots if that happens again. I think the good news is in terms of total food supply, we're in very good shape. We actually created a tool. You can Google it, the Purdue Food and Agricultural Vulnerability Index, where we're trying to measure risks to the food supply, quantity of corn, soybeans, wheat, edible beans that we have that could be impacted by farm worker illnesses. Those potential risks are very small. One way to think about that is agriculture is seasonal too. So the corn we're harvesting right now, so once that's in storage, it's there. Where the risks are potentially in that processing sector. We already mentioned egg processing, meat processing. It's where the labor is most dense that I think we have to be a little bit more worried about. I mean, the good news is, I think at least on the meat packing side of things, they've lived through a very tumultuous time. They've made a lot of changes. Workers in those plants are more socially distant. They've installed barriers between each other in those plants. They have, in some of those companies, have actually got medical staff in place on those plants. So they're better prepared, but of course it doesn't mean that you can't have something terrible happen. The other big disruption, of course, was this sudden shift from food away from home to food at home. Grocery stores were not, able and prepared to deal with that demand spike they did. But we're already spending much more of our funds in grocery stores, so they've already responded to that shock in some ways. So my anticipation is, even if we get an uptick in COVID cases this fall, yes, we may see some disruptions, but I don't anticipate the kinds of disruptions that we saw back in March.
Great. Well, we're continuing with the COVID theme. So some food exporting countries in the world withheld their export during COVID for the concern for food safety. Do you think the pandemic has had an impact on global food security?
Sure. Well, it's had an impact probably on U.S. food security, because we can see some of the lines that have occurred at food banks. We don't have good data yet on our food insecurity measures in this country. My view is that was not necessarily a food system problem. That's an economic problem. If you lost your job and your income fell, you're not able to buy anything, including food. And that drove, at least in this country, a lot of the food security problems. Imports and exports, the U.S. is a net exporter of agricultural products. We send more food abroad than we import. So as a result, let's say things got really, hairy. We have more than enough food in this country to feed our consumers. So I think that's, at least on the one hand, a positive side. Now we may have to give up some bananas and jalapenos in the winter, but at least in terms of our aggregate food supply in this country, it's good. Globally, I think there's the FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, puts out a food price index, which looks at food commodities. It's started to inch up here in the past couple of months, but still I'd say fairly modestly in historical terms. And that's a real signal, I think, of whether we're in a troubling place globally.
Okay, so this is a bit longer question, so just a pre-warning here. You talked about the cost-benefit approach, where policy can be designed to maximize the most benefits for the greatest number of people. Earlier in the talk, you presented your findings that high-income households could benefit more than low-income households from the fat tax healthy subsidy design. How should we think about both of these two topics together? Should there be more focus on low-income households to increase overall equity, or should every group be treated the same to promote equality? To sum up, how should we weigh equity versus equality?
Yeah, so that's you're asking me to take off my economist hat and try to put on a philosopher hat, and I don't wear that hat very well, except just to say these things can be in tension with each other. Now, one way I think my French colleagues would probably be in this camp is to be a lot more technocratic about it. We're going to alter prices this way and then increase prices on the rich and then try to redistribute that to the poor in some way. So, because we think there's enough benefits being created here, we can redistribute those benefits in a way. And I think that's the way a lot of economists think about it too. In reality, it's really hard to do, and those kinds of distortions can come out when we try to think about how we're going to actually implement that sort of policy. I think our SNAP program is a program that tends to work pretty well at targeting low-income households. It targets the right people. It tends to reduce food insecurity. It's not very distortionary because it's essentially a cash transfer. There's some research out there that claims that it might be associated with increases in obesity. I think that's there's other research that I think is better, that's more causal, that suggests that's probably not true. So if you're looking for a policy that both sort of does what it's supposed to do and is equitable, I think SNAP overall is a kind of policy that does a good job in that respect. But it's a policy aimed at solving food insecurity, not health and nutrition. I think one concern people have, even of people that are very much in favor of SNAP, is why do you want to take a policy that we know works pretty well at doing what it's supposed to do in an efficient way and put all these other baggage on it? try to accomplish these other objectives. And so I think that's a real challenge, I think.
So our final question here, and the question writer says, great presentation, Jayson. What is the biggest surprise in your research program that you faced during the past 5 years?
Well, a couple. The GMO labeling one is probably one where I think you always want to be open to being willing to be convinced otherwise, particularly if you can generate evidence to do that. And I think that's one where I changed my mind about the potential implication of that part of the policy. And then the COVID reactions, I think that was totally unexpected. And I think, my schedule, like a lot of folks, particularly in the food industry, in March, April, and May was insane. And I thought as a food and ag economist, I thought I understood a lot about how our food supply chains work. It turns out I didn't know as much as I thought I did. And I think for years, decades, we'll probably have research questions that emerge out of this very chaotic time that we've lived through over the past 6 months. So I think I'm done with the Q&A. Teresa?
Well, I hope the audience will join us. And I'm going to take off my mask with appropriate social distancing. And thank you, Jayson. That was a really great presentation. And I just also want to thank the audience for great questions. I think that as difficult as it is to do this virtually and not be able to see the audience, what we're seeing is very, very active engagement. And this presentation will be made available for remote viewing later. So again, on behalf of Purdue University, I would like to present Jayson Lusk with the 2020 Luann Aday Award for his contributions to the field of food and agricultural economics and for the significant impact his work has had on food policy. And because of social distancing, I think hopefully you can, everybody in the audience can see the award. And once again, we thank you for everything that you do for Purdue, for the nation and the world. Your work is really having an impact. And I think it's also really exciting to hear that despite the challenges that we're facing, that we are learning. And those, hopefully, the lessons that we learned will help us in the future as well. So thank you all for taking part in the Luann Aday Distinguished Lecture. The next lecture in the series will be held on Tuesday, October 6th at noon. And this lecture will feature Chris Green, Distinguished Professor of Physics and Astronomy. I hope all of you can join us then. Thank you.